And welcome back to TIA 2014, day 2 of our 3-day conference on the network of the future right here in Dallas, Texas. With us in the Dell TINL studio to talk about the state of the industry is Tassu Shervani. He's a PhD at Marilyn and Leo Professor at the Cox School of Business at the Southern Methodist University, that's SMU. And Tassu, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Abe. Thank you for having me.
Sorry about the, I tripped up on the introduction, but I hope I got it right.
No, you absolutely did.
I appreciate it. I did have a chance to sit in on the latter part of your keynote address just earlier at TIA 2014, Network of the Future. Really interesting stuff, a lot of information there. I want to start by asking you about the global trends that you were speaking about and how they relate back to economies, companies, and networks. Let's start with global trends and economies.
Great. Abe, you know, there are two major markets that every firm really has to understand and address in great detail. The first one of those is the market for people, the market for talent. Every firm needs to have its fair share of the best talent of every generation in order to grow, in order to sustain its competitive position. As the telecommunications industry moves more and more towards a software-oriented, software-defined networks, network virtualization, you're going to need more software engineers. And that puts you in direct competition sometimes with players who are also going after those software engineers, the Googles, Apples, Facebooks of the world, where traditionally a TIA member company like Ericsson may not have competed quite so directly for the same talent as those companies do. So talent markets are incredibly important, and every firm has to understand where it's positioned in talent markets and how it can improve its position in talent markets. And the other market that's relevant is the capital market. Every firm needs to raise capital. Every firm needs to raise equity capital. Every firm needs to raise debt capital in order to be in business. And capital markets are also becoming more challenging as time goes by. In my talk, I talked very briefly about the currency market, which is only, one of several markets within the capital market overall. And if we just look at how complicated it's become over the years, it's incredible. 400 years ago, money was gold and silver. And if you wanted to transport money, you had to pick up the gold and silver and carry it with you. Now, in those days, 300 or 400 years ago, there was a lot of lawlessness as well. If you were, say, in Western Europe and you were transporting gold, there was a pretty good chance you would run into Robin Hood or someone like that who would take it away from you. So human beings said, well, how can we solve this problem? And the way that they solved it was by leaving their gold on deposit with a goldsmith, who would then give them a piece of paper in return which said that Mr. So-and-so has 50 ounces of gold. And people discovered that they could take that paper to another city, and that paper would be honored there because the goldsmith's name was recognized. And from that sprung the idea of issuing paper currency that was backed by gold and silver. So you could now keep the gold and silver in one place. And let's say you were transporting the paper money by ship and the ship sank. Well, instead of losing all your gold, the paper would go down, the paper would be useless, right? It'd become soggy, it'd become worthless, but you would still have your gold with you. And that situation lasted till after the First World War. But during the First World War, countries borrowed, European countries borrowed $50 billion. And instead of putting them to use in productive assets, they fought a war. So at the end of the war, they still had the debt, but they couldn't pay it back. So one after another, the countries of Western Europe started going off the gold standard. Britain went off the gold standard in 1925, for instance. And a few years later, the US was the only major country that was left on a gold standard. And even the US didn't last too long. In 1971, President Nixon finally took the US off the gold standard, and money became paper backed by the full faith and power of the government. Now, very quickly after that, within, say, 2 decades after that, we realized that money becomes entirely virtual. If you think about how you and I get paid today, we don't get paid in cash. At the end of the month, bits and bytes appear in our bank account. And if you think about how we spend that money, whether we're spending it on a mortgage or paying back a car loan or even buying a cup of coffee, instead of using cash, we are increasingly transferring those bits and bytes to somebody else's bank account. So money has become virtual, and now for the first time we are seeing the creation of new currencies that never existed in the physical world. They've only existed in the real world. And one of those is Bitcoin. That's been much in the news. Now, Bitcoin may not be the one that is successful. It may eventually have too many problems associated with it. But it's become very clear that increasingly in the future, money will become more and more digital, and it will become more and more virtual. So that's just an incredible example of a trend that not only affects the economy, but it affects every company that's in business, and it also affects networks. Because if we don't have safe and secure networks, if we don't have ubiquitous networks, it is going to be very hard to run a digital currency. Because think of it, you're not going to have paper anymore. You're not perhaps even going to carry credit cards in your wallet anymore. Your mobile device is going to be the way you make your payments. And the money is going to be, the bits and bytes are going to be taken out of your account digitally over the network. So we are on the cusp of just tremendous change in every aspect of capital markets and every aspect of labor markets. And that's the flavor that I tried to bring to the audience this morning.
Tassu, there's another global trend relating back to immigration reform that the tech industry has been talking about for a number of years, and the importance of immigration reform. Tell us about that global trend that's leading up to hopefully a potential reformation of the immigration policies in this country.
Abe, that is a great question. I shared some data this morning which suggested that today 194 million people in the world are working in a country other than the one in which they were born. I myself am an example of that. I was born in India, and here I am working in the United States and other countries. And there's another 194 million people, just like me, and I'm sure many in our audience are also in the same boat. And we realize that immigration has become, the movement of people from one country to another in order to work, has become an incredibly important pillar of the global economy. And the reason for that is that as the world becomes more and more driven by technology, we need more people with the skills and training in technology in order to do the jobs, the new jobs that are being created. The downside here is that there is also a trend that in many developed countries, there are fewer and fewer of our young people who are studying the so-called STEM disciplines, the science, technology, engineering, and math. In the United States, for example, in the 1960s, 20% of all our college degrees were STEM degrees. When we look at 2006, that's when our millennials, the so-called millennials, are graduating from college, only 9% of our degrees are either in physics or chemistry or math or computer science or one of the branches of engineering, down from about 20% in the 1960s. So at the same time as companies need more people who have the science and technology training, our universities are producing fewer and fewer such students because our students are not terribly interested in studying those disciplines. They are harder things to study. I like to say as a joke that we have raised our kids with a great deal of self-esteem. But self-esteem really takes a thrashing when it runs into differential calculus and organic chemistry. Right? These are subjects that everybody is going to struggle with, and kids then give up on those majors and they move to other majors. So increasingly, we have to look to get the talent from all over the world, from wherever in the world that talent might be available. Now, in some cases, we can go to that country, or people can work virtually, people can work digitally. But in other cases where you need a team and you need people to work together, you actually have to have migration to support it. We have had a very difficult time in the United States getting any kind of a consensus around immigration. President Bush tried, President Obama has been trying for 6 years with no success whatsoever. And again, it's in the news this year as well, where we're trying to pass immigration reform before the November elections, but it doesn't look very likely. And this is very dangerous because other countries like Canada and Australia have taken the lead in terms of having the right immigration policies, and if the United States falls behind in that regard, it's not going to be good for any of us. I'm optimistic that we will get something done. I am a little less optimistic, to be quite frank, today than I was a couple of years ago when it looked imminent, but I haven't given up entirely. I know that we have sensible people in Washington, D.C., and Winston Churchill once said that you can always rely on America to do what's right after the alternatives have been exhausted. And I think we will do that with immigration. After we have gone around the question a dozen times, we will come back and we will do something that will be reasonably sensitive and within the next couple of years.
Tassu, I'm going to ask you to play futurist just for a moment, if you don't mind. You talked about a lot of the global trends relating back to economies, companies, and networks. Now we're in 2014. In 2020, when TIA invites you back, assuming you accept the invitation, what will you be talking about then?
Oh, I would be happy to be back. I think by 2020 we would have seen a couple of things. So first, in the area of talent markets, I presented some data which suggested that the world needs about 50 million more college graduates by 2020 trained in the right disciplines. I believe that distance education, I believe that online learning, massively open online courses will be a very large part of the landscape because without those, we really can't get the job done. So I think that's going to be a very big piece of the puzzle. Taking it to the next step then, it means that firms have to build networks. If there's another 50 million people online who are watching videos, taking classes, not to mention all the other avenues of traffic growth. You can just see how quickly traffic on these networks will grow and overwhelm the network. So we need to develop lower cost methodologies of building and driving networks. Not the way that networks have traditionally been built, but more in the area of software-defined networks or network function virtualization. Things that can allow us to build the networks and the capacity that we are going to need for tomorrow. But if we need 100 times the capacity, it doesn't come at 100 times the cost. It in fact maybe only comes at 2 times the cost or 3 times the cost. And so we get huge efficiency improvements. I think we will have seen that. I think when we get together in 2020, the Internet of Things will also be a much bigger phenomenon. I think that big data, where clearly there's a lot of talk today, but I think we are going to start to see more and more value from big data emerging by 2020. And I think that will be a great point in time to revisit some of these things, because big data, which is in its early phases today, will be, if to use a baseball analogy, probably in the second or third innings by 2020, and it would be a great time to revisit that question.
I think it was a pleasure for everybody in that room just behind us to listen to your keynote today. Very informative, as I mentioned before. We learned a lot. We appreciate your time. And as you mentioned, as you said, you would accept our invitation. We would like to extend it, I'm sure, next year and years to come. So thank you.
Terrific, Abe. Thank you so much.
Tassu, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks again for joining our coverage of TIA's Network of the Future conference. The Dell TI Now studio will be streaming live throughout the conference. You can view our live stream and all of our programming at tinow.org. So long.